Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Barbie, the doll, it's a very complicated entity. And if parents know about the complexity and difficulty of Barbie, you have to make a choice whether you're going to welcome it in your home or ban it forever. But I think the complexity of Barbie transcends a personal situation. There are obvious expectations that are brought with the doll, and Barbie is a stand-in for those kinds of expectations. There are the obvious expectations, like Mattel wants to make money, so we're selling the product. But there are also different type of expectations. Barbie can be the embodiment and transmission of social expectations regarding the status, appearance, and even the existence of women. And expectations can be very powerful and important. I'll give an example of this. Among the many brilliant moves that Jane Austen makes in her novel Emma, there's one that stuck with me for years. And Austen has Emma mistake boredom for love. And here's the quote. She says, "This sensation of listlessness, weariness, stupidity, the disinclination to sit down and employ myself, this feeling of everything's being dull and insipid about the house, I must be in love." This is a remarkable moment, I think. It signifies the internalization of misogyny or oppression. Somehow, along the way, restrictions, limits, socially imposed ideals, expectations are being transformed into an emotion that we cherish and celebrate. Emma is bored without knowing it, but her boredom is not psychological, it's social. It is the result of externally imposed expectations. She's bored because she's told that she cannot do the things that she wants to do. There are many examples that highlight the power of expectations. But if we take that seriously, if we realize the potency of expectations, then the topic of Barbie becomes a very pressing one. Is Barbie the plastic embodiment of oppressive social expectations? Was it ever? Is it now? Or is it an opportunity to reimagine and change expectations, to play with them and rearrange as children play with their dolls and dollhouses? Barbie's created nature is very important. The very fact that it's created, it's a reminder that whatever expectations Barbie transmits, those were molded and created by us. But precisely because they were created, they can also be broken and undone. This is, I think, perhaps what Gerwig's movie does so well, or shows so well. It shows the possibility of Barbie Land and tells that as an alternative story of human history. In doing so, it offers evidence of the contingency, not the necessity of our situation. It tells us that narratives are not merely to be told, but also to be retold and perhaps untold in some ways. But if narratives and stories are to be told or untold, then how are we going to tell the story of Barbie? What's the right way of saying it? Well, that's a question that is too complicated for me. This is where Barbie becomes quantum physics for me. So I am delighted to introduce the person who can help us understand Barbie's history. Our speaker today, Professor M.G. Lord, is the authority on this very difficult topic. Professor Lord holds a BA from Yale University and an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts. She's a professor of the practice of English at the University of Southern California, a prolific writer and cultural critic, an investigative journalist, an award-winning author, a podcaster, and even previously a political cartoonist. She's the author of 4 books. This includes Astro Turf, The Private Life of Rocket Science, which is presents a cultural history of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and also a family memoir at the same time. She's the author of The Accidental Feminist, How Elizabeth Taylor Raised Our Consciousness and We Were Too Distracted by Her Beauty to Notice. And of course, she's the author of Barbie Forever, a remarkable, brilliant, and captivating telling of the story and social and cultural significance of Barbie. Professor Lord also created and co-hosted LA Made, the Barbie Tapes, a podcast that tells the story of the doll's creation in the voices of its original creators. And this podcast was trending #1, I think, on both Apple and Spotify.
On Chartable's rankings.
Okay.
I almost put it in the slides, but someone said, why are you putting your report card for a presentation to a group? I was reined in.
Yeah. Well, I can report on it. Finally, and before I turn the stage to Professor Lord, I wanted to take a quick minute to thank everybody who made this event possible. First of all, thank you for coming today. I'm grateful to the support that the liberal studies receive from the Visiting Scholars Fund. I'm grateful to everyone at the Louisville Public Library for this collaboration and for all the work that they've done to put this event. I would like to thank Carmichael's for coming, for being here, and for selling books. So if you don't have a copy of the book, you can find it here. And then I would like to thank Jana Tajibayeva for helping organizing and the event as well. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Lord for being here with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andreas. That was, oh, now I'm going to lose my voice. Thank you, Andreas. That was very welcoming. And it's great to be here. And it is so great to see this sea of pink in the audience. I'm wearing this sort of weird device. I feel like Madonna, this microphone thing. This is probably the only time in my life where I'm ever going to feel like Madonna. And I love being here in Louisville. This is my first time. And how many people, did everyone in the audience see the movie? Is there, yeah. Well, I learned something today about, actually, I got this cool thing. I went to Churchill, I'm not going to put it on, but it is a cool thing, right color. I learned something about the relationship between patriarchy and horses today at Churchill Downs. And I learned something that was actually, I mean, it really suggested to me that Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach were onto something. Do you know that no filly, no female horse has ever won the Kentucky Derby in more than a century and a half? And they don't even, they're not even, I mean, the fillies are severely discriminated against in terms of opportunities to participate in this event. Well, obviously, this isn't earth-shattering news to me, but I mean to you. But believe me, I'm taking this back to California, and I want to get people agitated about it. Ruth Handler was the sort of person who, who could look at something and find something really special and really interesting in it. And before we talk about, say, the relationship of Barbie to feminism, I will get to some credible content. I think we need a little refresher on just who was involved in the whole story and where did this doll come from. So, the faces behind the voices, this was a supplemental thing to my podcast that Andreas found such lovely information about. It still exists, by the way, on Apple, Spotify, etc. And you get the actual voices of people saying things so wildly indiscreet that they would never say them now. I mean, in a universe where everybody has a telephone that can record things, you would never get people being that indiscreet. So first of all, this is Ruth Handler, who actually invented the Barbie doll. She saw her daughter, Barbara, it's a little odd to name this thing after your daughter, but whatever, playing with paper dolls and projecting, an idealized future onto these dolls by changing the outfits that they wore. And she felt, well, how great if Barbara could have a three-dimensional plaything to do this, not as we learned in the movie, not necessarily to be taught with a doll to nurture, but to be taught to imagine a wider world for herself. I had the pleasure of meeting, well, more than just meeting. I spent a couple of days with Ruth. She was very generous. She opened up, the family scrapbooks and kind of let me in. But but I have to say, Greta Gerwig hit so many correct notes in that movie. But the Ruth Handler in that movie, that sweet old lady sipping tea, was not the Ruth Handler I met. I was terrified of her. She was formidable. This woman, if I'm a little rambly, you can just stop me. But the pictures will keep us on track. No, I mean when I first met her, she was scary. She ran a Fortune 500 company in the 1960s. I mean, right away for a woman to do that is just amazing. And she was muttering in the movie about her something financial, something or another's. Well, that's another thing that kind of slid by and shouldn't slide by in a real biopic. I admired her because she bounced back from a giant fall. I mean, her story is the classic Hollywood story: rise, fall, and then redemption. The rise, the creation of the Barbie doll against all odds. The male executives didn't want to have anything to do with we'll get into what Barbie is patterned after. Soon there will be pictures. But achieving that was remarkable. That would be enough for one lifetime. But no, I mean, when Mattel took the company public in the 1960s, and then they had a few bad years. And the short version is that Ruth Handler took the fall for the other executives, and including Ruth. I'm not getting her off the hook, but she became, well, she was convicted of conspiracy, mail fraud, and lying to the SEC. Somebody there cooked the books, and she took the fall. She was thrown out of the company that she and her husband Elliot founded in 1944. And this would have devastated a normal person, but not somebody with the kind of grit that Ruth had. She was distracted a little bit at that time because this isn't normally how I go into the Barbie talk, but I think so much of Ruth is in that doll that talking about Ruth makes sense. She had breast cancer. She had a mastectomy, and this distracted her from the business of running her company. So she's thrown out, she's humiliated, but she doesn't just vegetate. She sees another incredible opportunity. And Ruth went on to make, I kid you not, a second fortune designing mastectomy prostheses. This was the early 1970s. This was before the era of those little pink ribbons. And, my own mother actually had died of breast cancer in the 1970s when I was like 14. And I think Ruth spent time with me because I really admired this. I remembered my mother's own discomfort around the inadequacy of these prostheses. And Ruth's genius, almost like the genius of Barbie, was that she figured out the obvious thing that the male designers didn't get. Breasts are like shoes. There's a right one and a left one. And She started her company, Nearly Me, made a second fortune, never took it public. She got her, comeuppance from the SEC, and then sold it in the late 80s or early 90s to Kimberly Clark and made a very tidy sum of money. Well, which gets us again to the Ruth Handler that I remember. I first met her at the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles. She didn't want to see me, and I was living in New York at the time, and kind of kept putting me off, and finally she agreed to see me. And we got along famously. But her great line, I remember 1993, over an egg salad sandwich at the Hillcrest Country Club, she said to me about her career, "Honey, all my life I've gone from breasts to breasts." And let's keep going. Okay, here we go. Here's Jack Ryan. He's pretty fabulous too. And if anyone listened to LA Made the Barbie Tapes, the entire executive board and Ruth's husband, Elliot, with whom she had founded the company, did not want to make a doll with breasts. They were, but Jack, who was kind of I searched for euphemisms, who was kind of a playboy, never mind that he was married. Jack, and he was, Zsa Zsa Gabor was one of his wives. Anyway, a very kind of an unsavory fellow. A Yale graduate, an engineer who had worked at Raytheon on the Sparrow and Hawk missiles, but Elliot Handler met him and thought he had the potential to design some complicated, interesting, well-engineered toys. So Jack was brought in. And Ruth Jack supported Ruth in all of this. Ruth, the doll. I'm trying to even figure out how to narrate this history, particularly to a crowd that's probably familiar with it. In fact, since some of you have the earlier edition of the book, if I get something wrong, just raise your hand and say no, MG, on page 82. The correct number is whatever. A lot of toys at that time were made in Japan, and even today, Barbie has never been made in this country because labor costs are too high, but the original dolls were made in Japan. So Ruth tucks the model for this doll, whom we will meet in a second, into Jack Ryan's briefcase and sends him off to Japan. Well, this is a highlight of the Barbie tapes is listening to Jack Ryan discussing the imperfections in the original prototypes and how he took his little Swiss file used for doing those delicate watch parts to, if you will forgive, emery board off the nipples on the early prototypes. I mean, and it's just wild with a complete lack of inhibition. He discusses this. So there's Jack. He's a player in this. And that is the thing that Barbie was knocked off of. The Build Lily doll, who does not look a lot like Barbie. I mean, as a piece of sculpture, the Lily doll and the Barbie doll were pretty much completely identical. But their invented personalities could not have been farther apart. The Lily doll was now I've got to come up with euphemisms, I mean, Jack Ryan just called her a German streetwalker, and he also used the term hooker, but this is 2024, so I have to say a German sex worker. Based on a comic strip character in the Bild Zeitung, a sort of downscale German tabloid, not dissimilar to something like the National Enquirer. She was based on a cartoon character in a single panel cartoon, and in almost every cartoon, Lily was taking money from jowly fat cats for sexual favors. My favorite of the cartoons, which alas is not in the new book, because we had some copyright concerns, but it shows Lily I'm going to justify having the Madonna thing. If I don't have to stand. It shows Lily standing in the apartment of a female friend, completely naked, holding up the Bild-Zeitung, a tabloid, to cover her naked body. And the caption is, "We had a fight and he took back all the presents he gave me." End of story. And the caption on that is, you should invite Lily at every opportunity. Not necessarily the kind of opportunities we find around my university, but maybe it's different here in Louisville. Another one, whether more or less naked, Lily is always discreet. Just what you want in a kid's toy. Oh, and this is something else that I had been thinking about, an even older relative. We'll kind of go back to feminism, but I think that one reason for Barbie's endurance isn't just Mattel's incredible publicity machinery. I think that, or the fact that her outfits keep up with the times, and we will get into this later, or if we don't, you can ask me, the idea that Barbie both shapes and reflects the marketplace. There's that, but there's also something more profound, and that's where this Venus of Willendorf comes in. The Venus of Willendorf, like all of these Venus figures, are portable objects of veneration for a mother goddess, Mother Earth, the great mother. And I argue that Barbie, or at least not necessarily argue, but advance the possibility, entertain the concept that Barbie might be a space age recasting of a Stone Age fertility totem. And I rest my argument on her feet, or the relative lack of them. All of these portable objects of veneration did not have feet. They tapered to a prong, like Barbie's itty-bitty arched feet. And that was really important because in order for them to stand up, they had to be plunged into the earth. Again, Mother Earth, the great mother, the Chthonian source of their power. And Barbie, as a work of art, kind of echoes that. And now, of course, some of you were thinking, well, that doll that many people have blamed for eating disorders does not look like that Venus figure. But in fact, in the Cyclades at about 1100 BC, the Cycladic idols, figures that had a similar function to these portable objects of veneration were created. And they look a lot like Barbie, with shoulders that are wider than their hips. They look a little bit like Brancusi's. They're kind of abstract. Anyway, I think that it's entirely possible that Barbie has kind of not just a metaphorical resonance, but maybe a kind of symbolic resonance, something that operates under our conscious radar that makes the doll so compelling. There's Jack. There's Jack in the castle that he built in Bel Air. Rambling anecdote. I had actually met him years before I even started on this project because he went to Yale. And it's April, so in my mind, it's the month where college students have to make decisions about where they're going to go to college. And Jack Ryan hosted the party for the people in the greater Los Angeles area who had been admitted to, and I'm sure that, you go to this crazy castle, and he had a giant tree house with chandeliers, and he had talking lions, and, it's like, okay, cool, I'm going to that school. So... But he also was, a cocaine addict and a sex addict, and he had kind of a lot of darkness in his life that we did not explore in the podcast because the interns at Southern California Public Radio accused us of being kink negative. So we had to do a quick pivot and get away from that. I should mention, if you do want to listen to the podcast, which is still available, I think it's even up on YouTube. My co-host, Antonia Sarajido, has a very different perspective than mine. And a lot of it has to do with our age difference and, the fact that Barbie is of interest to many generations. In 1992, when I began doing a lot of the interviews for the book, Antonia's parents were busy conceiving Antonia, so her life experiences, or at least were significantly different from mine. And this is again the podcast. This is as close as I came to putting my report card in a slide deck. And it led to, well, what you're aware of, the fact that the book is back in print again. Well, because I'm going to say the second episode of our podcast, the whole thing is called The Battle of the Bulge. Well, let's go back to that portable object of veneration. The matriarchal religions, the mother goddess, came before the very patriarchal religions that followed, like, Judeo-Christian monotheism. In the same way, one could argue that Barbie came before Ken. Yeah. Barbie came out in 1959. Ken came out in 1961. He was an afterthought, an accessory. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book in the hope that you will want to take it home and read it to everyone you know. We reconstructed this little segment of the book. The whole second episode is called The Battle of the Bulge. It's about the designers, I conflate Mrs. Handler, Ruth Handler, with Barbie. Mrs. Handler, Charlotte Johnson's Barbie's really fascinating first dress designer, and the male executives squabbling over what Ken's crotch would look like. Battle of the Bulge. Just give me. It's just going to be a tiny bit of reading. Don't have your eyes roll. It's pretty fascinating, and you can hear the actual voices in L.A. Made the Barbie Tapes. So, making Ken's clothing was, however, far less of a problem than making Ken. At Mattel, a storm raged over his genitalia. Ruth and Charlotte, who wanted what Ruth termed a, quote, bulge in his groin, squabbled with the male executives, who didn't. After the women vetoed a male doll that resembled Barbie in the crotch, 3 new versions were sculpted, with 3 degrees of what Charlotte called, quote, bumps. If you listen to the tapes, you will have met Charlotte, so it'll be a little bit of recognition. Quote, one was, you couldn't even see it, she said. The next one was a little bit rounded, and the next one really was. So the men, especially one of the vice presidents, were terribly embarrassed. And he was a middle-aged man, nothing to get embarrassed about. So Mrs. Handler and I picked the middle one as being the one that was nice looking. And he said he would never have it in the toy line unless we painted jockey shorts over it. Quote, none of us wanted a doll with a penis showing, Ruth amplified. Quote, if the child took off the swimsuit, we felt it would be inappropriate with an adult boy, whatever an adult boy is, to show the penis. So we all reached a conclusion that he should have a permanent swimsuit. All except Charlotte, that is. She said, quote, do you know what every little girl in this country is going to do? They're going to sit there and scratch that paint off to see what's under it. What else would they do? Reluctantly, the men agreed. Ken got his bump, but in a version modified to fit under trousers. Quote, I had to work with the sculptor a little bit, Charlotte said, because I realized when we were putting zippers in the fly and the zipper on top of that bump, it got bigger and bigger. Nevertheless, we're going to go a little bit Freudian here because in the early 1990s, Freud was not so discredited. Nevertheless, somebody at Mattel was disquieted by Ken's absent genital and tried to help him compensate. Barbie's clothes were usually accessorized with a matching purse, and purses, box-like containers, are recognized by Freudians as symbols for female genitalia. Ken's first garments, by contrast, came with long, thin accessories, symbols for the penis he lacked. I just love standing up here and talking about it. All that pink and laughter. I mean, what could be more fun? Anyway, a long stick with a school pennant accompanied his campus hero outfit. An electric shaver with a dangling cord accompanied his bathrobe. And his weekend casuals, khakis and a t-shirt, came with car keys. A key is, of course, a male symbol penetrating a female lock. By 1963, Ken's phallic props had become outrageous. He had a hunting outfit with an enormous rifle, a baseball outfit with a very long bat, and a doctor outfit with a pendulous stethoscope. He didn't motor around in a roadster like Barbie. He drove, I kid you not, a hot rod. But the cruelest comment on his genital deficiency came in 1964 with Cheerful Chef, a backyard barbecue costume that included a long fork skewering a pink plastic weenie. Barbie's cookout set had featured a spatula, a rolling pin, and a spoon. She never, ever had either a fork or a weenie. True, her suburban shopper outfit had been accessorized with vaguely phallic bananas, but they were popping out of her purse, a merging that subliminally suggests heterosexual intercourse. Similarly, her picnic set included a fishing rod, but its hook had pierced a plastic fish, a vulgar symbol for the female genitals, again evoking heterosexual penetration. The seeming deliberateness of these symbols makes it hard to interpret Ken's sad, solitary sausage as innocent. Likewise, the message on his apron, "Come and get it," seems a bitter taunt about the genital he will never possess. Poor Ken. Well, that was 1963. And in 1963, Barbie, Charlotte Johnson kind of created the doll in her own image. Let me know when we need to break for questions. But I think we want to at least touch a little bit on the idea that while, Barbie is a Rorschach test, is an ink blot, is what you project onto her. But you could argue, and I do, that by 1963, from the get-go in 1959, those of you who collect Barbie objects know that Barbie always had paraphernalia for some sort of career. Busy gal, came with a portfolio of fashion sketches. Charlotte Johnson invented Barbie in her own image. And I definitely think that she was giving a proto-feminist message. What she was conveying in the vocabulary of objects to little girls was what their older sisters were reading in Helen Gurley Brown's 1962 book, a very subversive book, Sex and the Single Girl, which, despite its breathy prose, I wouldn't know anything about that, was an anti-marriage manifesto and an argument for women's financial and sexual autonomy. But for second wave feminists, let's move up to 1963 when Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. And 1966, when Friedan is one of the founders of the National Organization for Women, to second wave feminists, Barbie was an emblem of, of female oppression. They didn't see the tiny outfits with the possibility of little girls projecting themselves into interesting careers. They just saw the kind of creepy clothes mannequin body under it. And at Toy Fair in 1971, you could almost argue in 1968 with the first protests of the Miss America pageant, second wave feminists made very clear that the kind of looks that Barbie embodied, not the box, Barbie, were somehow demeaning to women. But time passes. I mean, I wrote this 30 years ago. People thought I was nuts. Now Greta Gerwig has made me mainstream. And it's also because of the evolution of feminism. By the early 1990s, when this book came out, third wave feminism, I love the waves. Third wave feminism was beginning to push Barbie's little surfboard around. And third wave feminism was a lot less judgmental than second wave feminism. One of the things that it enshrined was the right to pleasure for women. And if pleasure included dressing like Barbie, well, they were, withhold judgment. It's not, it's not your call. And then more recently, around 2012, you get another iteration of feminism, fourth wave feminism. It was largely online, and it had two main components: intersectionality, meaning kind of, the coming together of people who are marginalized for different reasons. I'm sure someone in the group will correct that definition, but it's useful instead of just throwing out the word. And body positivity. Body positivity also affected Mattel's decision in 2016, finally, to tamper with the body of the German sex worker. Mattel, they're like the sizes of the coffees at Starbucks: petite, petite, curvy, and I don't remember, petite, curvy. Why isn't someone helping me out there? Some Barbie. Anyway, it's the equivalent of the big one. That's getting into Ken territory. Let's see. Yeah, whatever. They tampered with Barbie's body. And I write a little bit about Project Dawn. There's a good movie about it by Andrea Nevins called Tiny Shoulders. I'm in it, crying over my dead mother, but that's okay, because otherwise it would have been nothing but a film about corporate feminism, and somebody has to show some real feeling. Let's see. We've covered body positivity. We've covered changes in feminism. And I think Greta Gerwig's movie using this popular totem to make a comment on, on the state of women was absolutely genius. I wrote a piece for the Hollywood Reporter just because of the Motion Picture Academy's rules. Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach's script had to be categorized as an adapted screenplay because the intellectual property existed in another state. But I mean, that script was wholly original. And it's important, and I think what the movie was actually about was what it means to grow up as a woman. Barbie Land was not invented by Mattel. It wasn't invented by Greta Gerwig either. It's basically it's the possibility of childhood. It's the way you can play with your dolls and imagine kind of a limitless future. Of course, of course, Issa Rae is the president in Barbie Land. Of course, the Barbie Land is what you play as a child. They named it, but it's I think a concept and a kind of hopefulness in childhood. But then puberty happens, and the dawn of puberty is the advent, is the metaphorical equivalent of Barbie entering the real world, where where women are up against extraordinary limitations, and they're eyed constantly, lasciviously, and with an undertone of violence. I believe that pointing these things out was extraordinarily insightful. And, some of my gender studies colleagues at USC feel that, well, that wasn't particularly sophisticated. Well, I think it was, and I think it was exceptionally daring in something that made $1.44 billion and made women all over the world feel seen. It was an extraordinary movie, and the message was extraordinary. The idea that many people who would not, in the course of their normal lives, think about the idea of patriarchy, and suddenly they were. Thank you, Barbie. Thank you, Greta Gerwig. There are all sorts of other things I could say, but I think maybe I should thank all of you for coming and maybe take a question or two. Does that sound reasonable? I'm looking for guidance and nobody's guiding. Is that good? I know a lot more than I've told, so bug me with questions. Yes, in the back.
Jack Ryan's wife oddly looked like the 50s edition Barbie. Did you see that somewhere?
Oh well, Zsa Zsa Gabor was a sex object. Was like a jokey sex object in the which probably figured in Jack Ryan's eagerness to marry her. But the marriage didn't last but a few months because they both discovered something terrible about one another. Zsa Zsa thought Jack had a lot of money, and Jack thought Zsa Zsa had a lot of money. And when this didn't pan out, they headed for divorce court. Also, interesting about Zsa Zsa is my earlier book, which was a cultural history of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In the early days, the physicists and engineers were primarily men, but there were probably women with graduate credential who could have been physicists or engineers, but they worked as computers. They basically did the calculations, for the early space missions. And the computers and the secretaries at the Jet Propulsion Lab would compete in a sort of Miss America contest that at first, Barbie came out in 1959, NASA was formed in 1958. At first it was called the Misguided Missile Contest, but later, the misguided missile was tossed to the side because JPL was no longer doing, just missiles. They were doing space. They were sending satellites up, and Zsa Zsa Gabor was in a movie called Queen of the Universe. So the competition at JPL turned into the Queen of the Universe competition. That was a weird piece of trivia that you will never use. Probably even if you get on Jeopardy, they won't ask you something that obscure. Yes.
As a scholar or researcher in the 90s, did you encounter any pushback about studying Barbie in academia?
Pushback? Yeah, but yes. That's the but on the other hand, things were kind of changing because I talked about what was very hot and fashionable in the 1990s, which was Judith Butler and the whole idea of gender as a performed identity. And a lot of that still holds up, and I retained a lot of the language from Judith Butler. The notion that that Barbie and G.I. Joe maybe could be teaching tools for the performance of gender. Because, there's nothing anatomically gendered about plastic Barbie. It's all about an idea around femininity, or with Ken, an idea around masculinity. Now, in the podcast, the producer and my co-host kept wanting to muzzle me when I went on my tear about homeovestism. Anybody remember that from the book? Well, so excellent. You get an A because in today's world, an A minus is a C. Homeovestism is a word coined by the late psychoanalyst Louise Kaplan. And it's a really interesting idea. Homeo meaning of the same, and vestism meaning clothes. And the idea is that if you're uncomfortable around your cross-gender strivings, you deck yourself out like a parody or an exaggeration of your own gender. For instance, Scarlett O'Hara. Is there any character in literature or cinema who is stronger and tougher and more archetypically masculine than she is psychologically? No. But who flits around? I'm using the portable microphone. Who flits around in those hoop skirts? And, she over codifies as female because, that's, and in the same way, for instance, a man who felt uncomfortable about cross-gender strivings would the book was written in the 1990s, so would deck himself out like Norman Schwarzkopf, who was a Gulf War general, probably Arnold Schwarzenegger, any sort of extreme caricature of archetypal masculinity in the popular culture. So, there's some of the ideas from the 1990s are dated, but I think that the big one about the performance of gender is still being built upon now. But yeah, people thought it was ridiculous. But it isn't. Thank you, Greta Gerwig. Any other? Yes.
I've always maintained that you could tell when Ruth Handler left the company because of Skipper.
Oh, I brought my friends. I am so happy that you mentioned Skipper. So often I get upstaged by them, but I was about to forget my friends.
Skipper started off as sister to Barbie, and then all of a sudden when Ruth left, Skipper became a teenager.
Well, I mean, the deal was with Ruth. I mean, with Charlotte Johnson marginalized. Well, here's an important thesis in this book, because the doll was never a doll invented by men to subvert women. It was a doll, for better or worse, invented by women to teach women what, again, for better or worse, was expected of them. But with Ruth not having her hand on the tiller of the company, you make a really good point. The men took over the line. I mean, I could be lugging a whole bag and boys like action toys. So the men assumed that little girls wanted action toys. The action toys from that period were unbelievable. There's a kissing Barbie that sort of cranes back and puckers up and makes a really creepy vinyl on vinyl noise. But now I kind of wish we had this thing on, because this is the doll you mentioned, Growing Up Skipper, who I think is just I don't know. I think if I were a little girl, this would have so thoroughly traumatized me. Growing Up Skipper, I wish you could hear the creak of vinyl. Oh, are you turning this thing? Oh, are they both on? Okay, creak of vinyl. Thank you. All right, so we know what's happening. Creak of vinyl, twist her arm. She grows 1/4 of an inch and sprouts breasts. I know, your jaw is doing what mine did the first time I saw it. This is what men actually thought little girls wanted. But the really neat trick is you do this, and it snaps right back down, and the breasts go away. Yes, you watched that correctly. 1/4 of an inch, and then they go away. And the idea was that you would have to buy 2 different wardrobes for the doll. Well, this, as you pointed out, is creepy, but where the Skipper thing to me gets sinister and really is sending a poisonous message to little girls was the growing up Skipper room. The short version is when Skipper was a little girl, Skipper had a desk on which she could do her homework. But when the room grew up, the desk turned into a vanity where she could put on makeup. I mean, that one just, some of the early decisions were just unbelievable. Or the evolution of Barbie's relationship to the aviation industry is another good one. Initially, Barbie was a flight attendant, which, in 1963 was maybe not such a terrible job. Except a few years later, there was the first Barbie or an early Barbie airplane. And there was no cockpit. The cockpit was painted in with a male pilot. So there was no way that Barbie could cut her. Now, of course, there's pilot Barbie. There's, she can do anything on that airplane. And just to keep pushing my homeovestism hobby horse, in the early 1980s, well, as you pointed out, in the 70s, the company was kind of rudderless in terms of women making decisions for the Barbie line. But by 1980, Jill Barad, who would go on to become the CEO of Mattel, was the president of the Barbie line. Also, as I mentioned, Barbie shapes and reflects the marketplace, and she has had her greatest successes when she's kind of in harmony with the ethos of the whole society. Not only were those men making that thing in the 1970s, but also the 1970s were not about conspicuous consumption. I mean, people were burning draft cards, marching against the war, looking schlubby. The idea of piling up material objects was not a popular notion. But in the 1980s, we saw the ascendancy of Wall Street in the popular consciousness. We heard the mantra, greed is good. And all of a sudden, Barbie and her stuff, she was right in harmony with and Jill Barad was picking up on that. And, women were in the workplace. Women were in the workplace in large part because, because of inflation and a need to work. It wasn't necessarily a glamorous choice, but they were very much there. And Jill came up with this genius thing of day to night Barbie, which is actually the message of homeovestism. So by day, executive Barbie has that pink suit that you probably saw Margot Robbie wearing at one of the Barbie events, kind of a long skirt. It came with, this is really a museum of the 1980s, it came with a briefcase that had a paper copy of the Wall Street Journal, a calculator that was like the size of a refrigerator. It had everything that an executive needed in the 1980s. But, she was powerful by day, but by night, she takes off her jacket and she takes off the skirt, and the little blouse thing, folds into some drag queen dress for the rest. The message was party, 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 but basically it was overcompensate for the masculine appearance that you have during the day. And the degree to which the jobs were important required greater overcompensation. This brings up the aviation industry, because Pilot Barbie was, I'm searching for euphemisms, but one butch gal. She had a necktie, and boy, when Pilot Barbie did her day to night thing, she twisted around her little blouse, and she had a poof skirt, which Susan Faludi wrote about specifically in Backlash as being an infantilizing and demeaning, piece. So, of course, Pilot Barbie with the necktie by day and a whole airplane had to wear this, demeaning, infantilizing costume. I don't think Mattel liked that analysis so much. But I think it's valid. Or, it certainly holds up as I feel with my students' papers, if you can make the argument, it's fine. You can make, so any other, have I really silenced you? Oh,
As you were talking about Barbie and the Mother Goddess, it led me to some thoughts about the Puer Aeternus and the Mother Goddess, and the relationship between a lot of men who don't grow up, who are looking for a Mother Goddess, and how that plays out in our everyday life today. So I think there might be an interesting connection between that mythology and what you were talking about, the Barbie and the Mother Goddess.
if you were one of my students, I would say publish this. No, honestly, I think that's entire. I think you could totally make that argument plausibly.
Well, thank you. But you just activated it as I was sitting here.
No, well, I hadn't even. If that's a really interesting thought. I will do my best not to steal it from you, or else let me know to whom I should give attribution. Yes.
So you mentioned the second wave feminist sort of depression of Barbie as a figure of sort of anti-feminism and body
Dysmorphia. Well,
things that would hurt the child's developing idea of the self. But one thing that you do in the book kind of connects with that. One thing that you do in the book that I haven't heard you talk about is the way artists have used the doll to create new art, right? And one of the most interesting to me examples of that is Todd Haynes.
oh, right, exactly.
You could talk about that also suppressed work of art and what role Barbie was playing in that.
I wish that this were available. Todd Haynes, when he was at Brown, made a movie about the Karen Carpenter story, Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story, and he used mutilated Barbie dolls to tell that story. And it's a tremendously moving film. But actually, Mattel was not the arch villain in this. The Carpenter family. I mean, her music is so incredibly moving, and you lose a lot of the emotional heft of the film if you don't have the music. And A&M Records and the Carpenter family put the kibosh on that. I think Mattel may have filed some sort of amicus brief, but they're the ones that. And Todd proposed, just having it distributed to, say, clinics where eating disorders were being treated. But the Carpenter family wanted no part of that either. But, that was actually, I'm glad you brought that up. That was one reason why I did the book was, I knew it was a great business story with knocked off from this German, thing, gag gift by a woman, who went on to make a second fortune designing mastectomy prostheses. And it's a great book about business, international consumer capitalism. But also the doll lodged in the heads of children in ways that were very personal. And A.M. Holmes's story, A Real Doll, is a good indicator of that. There are other things I mentioned in the book, but I'm going to go all autobiographical here, which is I didn't really think about Barbie. I think I mentioned my mother died when I was a child, and I didn't have a very good relationship with my father, who disappeared into the Jet Propulsion laboratory, which is why all those years later, after Barbie sold well and I didn't know what to do next, I thought, what do I want to? I know what I want. I'm going to spend 8 years at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to find out where that damn man went. No, but I hadn't really thought about my dolls. And when I was about 30, the dolls had been in storage since, since we moved my room. I thought he threw everything from my childhood out, but he didn't. And this box of stuff arrived. I'm living in Manhattan, and one of the things in the box were my Barbie case, my Ken case, and the sad little box that Midge, the one they got me first, the ugly sidekick doll, with whom I identify. Barbie could not have written her own biography. It's always the owlish drudge Midge. Oh, we have pregnant Midge. We'll end with pregnant Midge, but I do want to tell my story. So I didn't open these containers right away. I don't know why. They creeped me out a little bit. They're sort of these soft plastic sarcophagi. Anyway, I opened them. I opened Ken first, and he bounces onto the floor. The short version, the dolls were baroquely cross-dressed. Ken was wearing Barbie's Solo in the Spotlight, that slinky black chanteuse outfit with like a ruffle, a tutu that fell at Barbie's ankle, but mid-calf on him, long gloves. And Midge and Barbie were wearing what I would have worn for 20 years in storage. Ken's khaki trousers, oversized man's shirt, and navy blue blazer. I think it had a crest of some sort on it. They looked like they had just escaped from some boys' boarding school in New England. And I looked at them and I thought, major gender confusion. But again, this was the early 1990s in New York, and I thought major. But then I thought anyway. It's the early 1990s. So sue me. I had a real Park Avenue Freudian psychoanalyst, and I took my Barbie cases and the little Midge box on the subway up to my Park Avenue psychoanalyst. This may not work now on the subway, but I can tell you if it's crowded and you want a place to sit, look like a crazed 30-year-old with an armload of Barbie material, and they're going to shy away. But actually, when we got there, I talked about what was going on in my life when I cross-dressed the dolls. And my mother was dying of breast cancer, and I realized I cross-dressed them to protect them. Yeah, to protect the girls with all the layers. And Ken was allowed the luxury of feminine display because he wasn't vulnerable in the same way. And this was the piece that made me kind of decide that the book would be interesting, because it's, Barbie, and it's also, I think, why the movie touched so many people, because Barbie is kind of a part of our subconscious, even if we, she's a possibly an ancient archetypal feminine symbol. She can mean something in the inner life of a child that's bigger than just the business story. I don't know quite where we got to that, but let's just end with poor Midge. They phased her out, I think, in '67. What a hell chore to be Barbie's best friend. You're really, she's with blemishes painted on her face. That poor Midge. I'll end quickly here, but. So they brought her back briefly in '87, but they really brought her back in 2004 in this condition. This is Pregnant Midge. Now, Pregnant Midge was a huge sensation, a bestseller in Canada. Why Canada? Because religious extremists decided that because the ages that can be projected onto the dolls are like from 13 to 30. So they decided that Pregnant Midge was endorsing teen pregnancy, or worse, single motherhood. Never mind that if you come by later and check it out, on her left hand, she has a wedding ring permanently molded onto the left hand. But so anyway, Walmart with after a letter writing campaign and I believe some demonstrations, Walmart caved and pulled poor pregnant Midge from the shelves. She had a husband, but he was sold separately. And well, I think this is such a showstopper. I couldn't do this at the beginning because you'd stop paying attention to me, but we're going to do a little OBGYN thing here. So here's pregnant Midge. This thing is attached with magnets and suspense. And even worse suspense. What emerges looks like Annie Lennox around with the little blonde hair, like Annie Lennox around like 1984. But she was a hit in Canada. And I suppose on that note, unless there are other questions, I mean, anything else? Whatever I haven't said is probably in the book. And the new edition does have some thoughts on the movie and some thoughts on, the things that have happened at Mattel, including, slightly longer version of Project Dawn with the correct names of the different sizes, et cetera, and some comments from people at Mattel on the, transitioning away from the the German body to, well, we haven't even talked about Barbie's Friends of Color, but I think I probably used up my time. Anyway, thank you.